This is Public Access Michiana, and we have Bob Smith and Dr. E. Michael Jones as guests tonight. And let's start out with a scripture because we need something to ground our discussion tonight in. And if you look to Matthew 27:20, it says, "But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus." And verse 18 prior said, for Pilate knew that they had handed Jesus over because of envy." And the idea, the theme behind Public Access Michiana, the reason that we worked hard to resurrect public access is to, as even the FCC says, to bring other ideas to the marketplace. And this scripture is indicating that there was outside influences, because in chapter 21, Jesus rode the donkey in fulfillment of prophecy that he was the Messiah, the son of David, and they laid out palms in their coats, Hosanna to the King. They recognized he was the Christ. And 1 week later, it says the chief priests and the rulers persuaded the same people, many of the same people, to crucify the one the week before that they recognized was the Messiah. And so those outside influences were very negative, and it says here they were motivated in part by envy. And so one reason is for this Public Access Michiana is to have local people come together and discern outside influences, whether they're negative or positive, and to do their own critical thinking. And we're here to do some critical thinking. I don't know really where we want to take off exactly.
Well, we can look at some of the issues the people in South Bend are facing and look at what type of outside influences may impact them. And in keeping with the scripture you read, what may be on the inside or something that is internal to the person, such as envy or either some other reason that they may have to try to arouse the people just to do something that is negative. And in South Bend, for months now, since January, we've had the issue of the police tapes, what is on the tapes, when are the tapes going to be heard. That subject has been on the minds of the residents of South Bend and on the minds of the politicians and the people in the news. So that's an issue that we need to deal with, and it could have some outside influences there.
Well, I think the mayor has, that's what Mike had brought up before on one of our shows, that the mayor appointed a fellow named Wasserman from Massachusetts to kind of determine what kind of new police chief he had. And implicit in that was the idea it was going to be an outside influence. And so that's an influence that we need to critically evaluate. And you did a little discovering. You took 5 minutes to do a Google search. And
yeah. To see that the narrative that he's presenting is not an original narrative in South Bend, even though he claimed that it was because his father-in-law lives here, that he's tried this in other cities, and so on and so forth. San Francisco, Chicago, you get the foot in the door by saying you're going to work for $1, and then when your guy gets in, suddenly all these big contracts start being handed down to this network of people that he belongs to, which includes Homeland Security. So I think we need to put it in the bigger context here of how things get done in a culture like this where everything is sort of based on manipulation. And one of the crucial ways to get things done is to present everyone with a crisis. And I think you've already pointed at the crisis.
Yes.
This crisis about the police department and the So the classic explanation of this is Rahm Emanuel's "Never let a crisis go to waste." So it's going to be portrayed as if we have a crisis here. There's a crisis with the police department, then there's a crisis of law enforcement, and what we need then is someone to come in from the outside and solve the crisis for us. But that's why I think where we have to pull back and we have to analyze the situation, and we have to say, all right, we have a problem, but are you proposing the solution to the problem? Or are you just exploiting the problem so that you can push your own agenda forward? And I think that's what, that's what Gordon Duff was saying in the article that I quoted from Veterans Today, talking about the Israelization of the police force. Do we want a situation where we're going to have a kind of draconian clamping down without any understanding of what the underlying problem is? So I think that what we need to talk about tonight is, what's the underlying problem? What is the problem that this man from the outside, whoever he is, we don't know who he is yet, but Mr. Wasserman from Martha's Vineyard is going to find the man that's going to solve all of our problems. Well, what are the problems that we need to have solved here?
Well, as far as the police are concerned, they deal with crime, right? We have a crime problem.
Okay.
But can we define crime problem? I mean, how would you define we have a crime problem? How would you define crime?
Well, defining crime is easy enough.
Okay.
I mean, people rob people. There was a store owner on Lincoln Way. He had a store. What was he, a Hindu or something like that, or somebody like that? Anyway, he got robbed and murdered. Okay, it's pretty clear, pretty straightforward. Okay.
So that's what they're trying to solve?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that, yeah, but I mean, how do you solve that problem? Or is there any recognition of how this problem came into existence? And what I'd like to say tonight, what I'd like to put on the table for the discussion is the idea of social engineering. I'm saying we've all been guinea pigs in an experiment that's been going on for my entire lifetime, and for your entire lifetime, and your entire lifetime. And that is the social engineering of our cities. In other words, changing the environment, because then you're going to have some type of change in attitude because you change the environment. And the main way that the environment that I grew up in Philadelphia, the main way it was changed was by racial migration. Okay? There had black people coming up from the South in large numbers, and they started moving into the neighborhoods. The book that I wrote and the book that I gave to Robert is called The Slaughter of Cities, and what I discovered in doing that book was that these forces were orchestrated. This just didn't happen. It seemed as if it happened, but it was orchestrated for certain purposes of mainly political control. It was a social experiment, and like the classic social experiment, the story of the experiment is Frankenstein, where you start off and you think you're going to get one outcome, and suddenly you create a monster and you've got a whole different outcome. And I'm saying this is what happened as a result of their social engineering. Social engineering was supposed to get black people and white people, or black people and Catholics, to fight each other in the streets of Philadelphia, a battle that went on for a long time without any sense that they were being thrown at each other by a group of people that were invisible. And so the whole point of this skirmish was to focus the attention of people on each other rather than the powers who were orchestrating this. This was literally a battle. This was literally a war. It was a guerrilla warfare. My wife taught in Philadelphia. I think I've mentioned this story before. This Irish family shows up in Southwest Philadelphia. The guy's walking down the street and he gets killed. His sister was in my wife's class. Well, he didn't know there was a battle going on.
But he just come from Ireland, is that what you mean?
Because he came from Ireland, and as I said before, he didn't know he was white, because everybody in Ireland looked like him. And so he came over here, and suddenly he was a target because of some war that was going on that was not declared. And I'm saying it's time that we focused on the causes of what we're called, a lot of the crime that we're talking about here, rather than saying it's something that we as people in South Bend can't solve, and so therefore we need to bring someone in from the outside to solve it for us.
Okay. Going back to the scripture there, like the religious leaders, due to their envy of Christ, which was Christ had threatened their leadership there. Just so, therefore, they wanted to get rid of him. And then in the crisis that we have now, which is crime, who's going to benefit by exploiting the crime we have? And also, no one has identified yet what are the problems or the underlying causes of the crime, and so where do we, how do we get to identify those problems? Who's going to benefit, and then what is the gain? What is going to be gained from it?
Well, what do you think are the underlining? I mean, what if you proceed in that direction? What would you have any?
Well, off the top of my head, some of the things people may say is that, well, I don't have a job, so I need money, so I will take the money. But I don't think, I personally don't think money is everything. In this country, we have welfare. If you don't have a job, you will get some kind of welfare, but then still there is crime. Just so there has to be some other reason that is motivating people to do crime, and also there has to be some reason just why the crime has been exploited to, whereas we have to look outside to get a chief of police to help us to solve a problem, which that problem has not been defined yet. So what's to be gained? Is it clearing a neighborhood out? Is it getting property at a cheap value? What's the gain?
Well, in other words, but there hasn't been that much discussion on what really causes crime. That much.
Right.
I mean, Mike. I mean, I have my opinion. I mean, I would say, well, if there was a strong father in the home, I see crime as wrongdoing. Mm-hmm. Okay. And if you have a strong father, this is my little theory in a way, if you have a strong father, he tends to correct wrongdoing better than a single parent or this and that. I mean, how would you get?
I think the main issue that we saw during this period of time was, and I'm talking from Second World War on to the present, was the disruption of the social order. And the disruption of the social order can begin with the family, with the disruption of the order of the family. If the father's authority is questioned, or if the father abdicates authority and leaves, so that the child is not only being raised by the mother and not the father as well. These are all disruptions of the social order, but I think we need to focus on the fact that it was the government who disrupted the social order. And the main cause of the disruption was the need for workers to work in the factories during World War II. There was a huge need for this demand for labor. The only source of labor at this point, when you already had sent off 9 million people to war, to fight in war, there was only one pool of labor left, and it was the black sharecroppers in the South.
Doesn't this go back to that we didn't need to go into that war? Doesn't it?
We can go into a whole lot of things about the war and the empire and the Americans going toward empire and the people who tried to thwart this entry into the war and so on and so forth. But I'm saying once it started, there was the people took control. They declared a form of martial law, and they started to manipulate the social fabric in a way that war allows and is not allowed during peacetime. And so this allowed this disruption to begin by within 1942. I believe it's in the book, The Slaughter of Cities, 250,000 black people arrive in Detroit. Now, where are they going to live? Where do you suddenly put up 250,000 people? This is going to be disruptive of the social fabric, and it expressed itself almost immediately. The biggest race riot in America took place on Belle Isle, and I believe it was 1943. So you have this government-sponsored disruption of the social order that begins under the cover of war. There's a crisis. An orchestrated crisis, you could say, but there's a crisis nonetheless, and you have these people, the crisis managers who step in, they're going to deal with this in their way. I'm saying we've had a history of this all along, and we've had the history of social disruption of the social order following that, and as a result, we've had chaos spreading, and the chaos manifests itself as crime.
But you also talk about Frankenstein, and they don't intend it. They don't intend it.
I'm sure they did not intend. Now, that's probably they did not intend crime. But then we can get into what happened in Chicago. The first generation of blacks moves up to Chicago from Mississippi, and they bring their children with them, or they have children, and by the 1960s, these children are now teenagers, and they're growing up in an environment that has been totally disrupted. The parents don't know how to negotiate this environment. The kids are on their own, and when they're on their own, they form gangs. And so this was the rise of gangs in Chicago. The Blackstone Rangers were one of these gangs of these teenagers, a function of migration up from Mississippi. They were engaged in criminal activity, which is oftentimes what gangs do. At a certain point, the federal government they gave them $1 million. Sergeant Shriver, Office of Economic Opportunity, gave the Blackstone Rangers $1 million. Why did they do that? It comes out in the church hearings in 1976 that they knew they were engaged in criminal activity. So here is the government knowingly sponsoring criminal activity. So to some extent, it is the Frankenstein paradigm. That maybe you didn't intend it, but you created a disruption in the social order, a disruption in the moral order that you can't contain. You should be familiar with this. You know about chain reactions. Mm-hmm. You know about nuclear reactions. They can get out of control. You
Very
think
quickly.
You can control them. You think, and so these guys were like this great scientists who are going to set off this nuclear reaction, but they're going to control it because they're geniuses. Well, guess what? They didn't control it. And I'm saying this is what we have to address before we go running off to hiring some Israeli police chief who's going to treat us like the Palestinians on the Gaza Strip. That's not what we need here.
Because he's going to bring in that type of problem that was there in the beginning. In other words, the government trying to social engineering.
Well, let's face it, if he's from the outside, we're going to be aliens, right? This is precisely what you don't want to have with a police force. You want to have a policeman as a member of the community who has the good of the community in mind and is part of that community and would do what should do unto others as he would have them do unto him. That's not the Israeli model. The Israeli model is an occupying force that uses brutality because we're here dealing with subhuman people. Zionism is a form of racism. What we're doing is importing racist models to deal with the South Bend situation that is already racially polarized because we've lived in a racially polarized country for our entire lives. And there are a lot of people who have exploited this.
Well, it's interesting, just recently with Israel in the news, that President Obama is trying to stop some of that Israeli pressure. I mean, right? I mean, you follow that?
I mean, what you saw with this last UN vote is the United States is part of an ever-shrinking minority of people defending the indefensible, namely Israel's occupation of the West Bank. It's racism. It's apartheid. This was wrong in South Africa. How come it's right now when it's in the Gaza Strip? Well, the answer to that is because this same group of people controls the media, except for what we're dealing with right here. And this is why this is so important, because you're never going to hear this elsewhere. The fact that the United States is totally isolated in the world. In this last vote, it was the United States, Canada, and the Czech Republic. Everyone else either voted for a Palestinian statehood or abstained. And the abstainees were England, Germany, traditional allies of the United States. So what we're talking about here is the imposition, the importation of a problem that we don't need. We don't need that problem. That's been imposed on us by the Israeli lobby and their control of the media. We don't need to import that into South Bend, Indiana. We've already got problems, but the point of problems is to find out what's causing the problem. And so just because you got a blister on your foot doesn't mean you need to amputate your leg.
No, and people need to have confidence. 200 years ago, people only lived locally. There was hardly any outside influence in any community. Isn't that true? I mean, just 200 years ago.
Yeah, and also on the social engineering there, during World War II, there was a need for labor, and then and people from the South were encouraged to come north in order to take jobs. Philadelphia had a major racial problem there. There were certain jobs that blacks couldn't get. Also, there was a boycott of the trolleys or the buses there, and the military had to be brought in order to stop that. Now the boycott was caused by workers in a factory just where military weapons were made, and so the military needed those military weapons, and they needed the blacks to work in the factories, and also they had a problem of the trolley company not hiring enough people just to operate the trolleys, and they wanted to hire blacks, but the union at that time stated, we will strike, and they did strike, but the military came in just to bust up the strike and to protect the new workers who were hired to operate the trolleys there. Also in Detroit, where you had Jeeps made by Chrysler, planes made by Ford. They needed workers, just so they encouraged the blacks to come there. And as Mike said, once you bring these people there, where are the people going to live?
Conveniently.
Right, and such that you could see that something had to be done in order to create a place where people could live, live and work, and you had this common situation, which was World War II, and then anyone who's a U.S. citizen had to support the war effort.
Of course.
And in supporting the war effort, like you could have people who exploited that situation.
Well, World War I, if you didn't support it, you were put in prison in many cases.
Right.
So they knew not to oppose it.
Yeah, and such that the opportunity was there for exploitation of people, and another way of re-engineering the cities, and
social engineering it toward what they wanted,
right,
which
right.
may not be in a lot of
Right.
people's interest.
And then the question is, who are they? And the current question for South Bend is, what is the problem? Oftentimes the problem isn't what is publicized as a problem. Crime is something you can easily put your finger on. but the approach we have to it is to treat the symptom of it, not the cause. And the cause, once you fix the cause, you will not have the problem. But if you keep putting a Band-Aid on the problems there, after a while you will have a limb on your body which is basically covered with Band-Aids due to all the sores or the crime there, and we need answers to the problem, but first we have to fix the problem. And also on the social engineering that's been done, like we can't forget that it was the government who had experimented with LSD on the people back in the 60s there. And we don't know everything that the government has experimented with people. What drugs or what type of engineering, what business person will gain from social engineering of the cities. We don't know this, or it's not readily known by the common person.
Well, are we saying that, like, for example, there's the elders in the church, and their job is to protect the flock from false doctrine and da-da-da. Are we saying the city elders and the mayor should be aware of these outside influences and be discerning and not to let the wrong influences come in? Or
they should, but they didn't know. I mean, the federal government didn't let Mayor Daley know what they were doing when the Chicago was in the crosshairs. There was. I remember talking to some when I started writing, 30 years ago. There's a guy from Chicago. He's talking to me. He's on the Red Squad. Well, if I talk to him now, I'd say, wait a minute, you need a Quaker squad, because the Quakers were up to their eyeballs in all of this type of manipulation of what was going on. You need a University of Chicago squad. You need something to take care of all of these hidden forces behind the scene. I mean, just to give you an instance of what's going, like right now, like last week, Sunday night, we have a ceremony. President Obama honoring the Kennedy Center honorees, people who have won awards for outstanding achievement in life. Do you know who three of these people were? The members of Led Zeppelin. The three surviving members of Led Zeppelin. Now, I mean, I'm not a big fan of Google searches here, but you can type in Led Zeppelin and groupie in the Google search, and you will get story after story about these guys coming over here and having sex with 13-year-old girls. Now, if you had sex with a 13-year-old girl, you'd be in jail.
I'll be in jail
You'd
for
be in jail.
50 years.
But if this guy has sex with a 13-year-old girl, he gets a medal. So what's going on here? What's going on here? Do you mean to tell me Obama didn't know this when you can find it out in 3 seconds on Google? They didn't know that?
but it was already, by the time it got to him, it had been so pre-approved.
Well, then whoever approved it, someone approved child molester being 3 child molesters, or let me be accurate here, 2 child molesters. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant, there are all stories in there about all their 13 and 14-year-old sex partners during these tours that Led Zeppelin had in the United States. That's statutory rape, okay? Not a word, not a peep. Now, do you know why there wasn't a peep about this, about these guys? Do you know why these people are being honored now? Because they were involved in social engineering. That was what you adverted to with the LSD. MK Ultra was the CIA LSD operation, but rock and roll was there to corrupt your morals, and it was there to get you to take drugs, and the government was involved in that. and the government was involved in these social engineering projects that have left chaos in their wake.
But no one really believes that, because they would say, I really can't believe it. Why would the government do that? I mean, it just doesn't seem logical that a government would do that. So what's
would do what? What government wouldn't do what?
Would do kind of social engineering like that.
Would the government bust up your neighborhood? Do you think the government would bust up your neighborhood? I've got the proof of that in this book that I gave you. Louis Wirth was working for the Office of War Information when he hatched the plan of how to destroy the neighborhoods in Detroit. That's a book that I've already written. Now, when these black folk, they come up from the South, they see white people, but the white people, they don't think themselves white people. In Detroit, you're Polish. And you live in that neighborhood because all the Poles live in that neighborhood. And there's an unwritten agreement that when you come over from Europe, you can have your own neighborhood and your own culture. That was abrogated. The government reneged on that agreement and never told anybody about it. And I'm saying once they succeeded with this, they started moving forward, and they realized that you can control people by the music you listen to, because Plato said that 2,000 years ago.
But why? But the question is, why did the government want to do this? I know that Stalin did that in the Soviet Union because he wanted to collectivize and all that.
Why? Okay.
Why did they want to do this?
There is a fundamental divide here that you have to understand that has to do with Christianity. St. Augustine said there are two cities, the city of God and the city of man. And that all of human history is a battle between these two cities, okay? The city of God it's Christianity. And it's based on love of neighbor and love of God. Love of God to the extinction of self is what he said. The city of man is its opposite. So that means love of self to the extinction of God. And when it comes to neighbor, it's not love of neighbor. What's the opposite of love of neighbor? Controlling your neighbor for your benefit. Libido dominandi. The desire to dominate. That's what these people who run these government programs want to do. They want to control people. And the simplest and best way to control people is through the manipulation of their own passions. Because I can pull a gun out on you and say, give me your wallet. But it's better if I get you to hand it over on your own accord because you owe me interest payments on your credit card. That's theft. But you don't think it's theft. And you make a lot of money that way.
It used to be considered theft.
Yeah, well, not anymore. So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a fundamental... So the more that the country moves away from Christ and his commandments and his laws, the more we're going to go to the city of man, and that means more and more forms of control, social control. That's the history of secularization.
Do you think America is kind of a worst case scenario because we're so individualistic? I mean, like if you have Finland, everybody knows we speak Finnish here, and nobody else speaks Finnish anywhere in the world, and they kind of have a clan. They stick together. But America doesn't have that kind of identity. Doesn't have a
no. When the Finns came
ethnic
here,
identity. So we're kind of more individualistic.
Well,
so nobody does anything for the common good so much. I mean,
this country is the antithesis of ethnic identity, and so what happens with every ethnic group is that they are broken down, and integration. This is the big argument that Marcus Garvey had with W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP. It was an organization that was controlled by Jews, and all they wanted was blacks to integrate, which means they lose their ethnic solidarity and they lose their ethnic political power. And Marcus Garvey saw through that, and they declared war on him, and he ended up in jail because of that. That was the complaint of Harold Cruse, who wrote The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual in 1967, which broke up the Black Jewish Alliance that was the Civil Rights Movement. So what you have here is a constant warfare on the social order. Whether it's the ethnic neighborhood, any type of solidarity is a threat to these people who are in control. And so when they break up your neighborhood, then they try and break up your family. And breaking up the family is so destructive that it's like splitting the atom. You know what I mean? You split the atom, you release all this negative, destructive energy. And that's what happened over the course of this period of time. And we are now living in the fallout of that nuclear explosion. The nuclear family exploded. and the fallout's still falling down on months. So we don't need the Israelis to come in and create the Gaza Strip here to solve that problem, because it's not going to solve that problem.
Under Stalinism, under the Russian Soviet Union, wasn't it? It was almost illegal for like 2 or 3 or 4 people to even gather.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Began with the French Revolution.
Like under-
Revolution.
But you can achieve that from the top down, but you can also achieve that from the bottom up, right? I mean, you can cause it so that nobody even talks to their neighbor. Nobody even does gather except for some institutionalized event. Okay, it's just
Well,
like
that's what we have. I mean,
like when we grew up, there
what
was
do you-
sandlot
Yeah.
sports.
Yeah.
Everything was just, it's kind of happened.
What do you think professional sports are?
Organized.
Organized official gatherings,
Which defies the definition.
isolated, rootless individual. It's a pseudo ethnic identity.
And it almost it's denying the actual definition of a sport, because sport by nature is the spontaneous, unorganized event. And once you organize it, it's becoming the opposite of what was intended. But anyway, you were
like you mentioned the family, and the family is the nucleus of a group, meaning that in any neighborhood you have the total neighborhood.
Matt, can I intervene and
Yes.
just say that you used to work for
Right.
28 years
38 years, you know.
in the nuclear.
Yes, and in the
So he understands nuclei.
I feel
Right.
So a neighborhood, it is made up of families, and then families make up a city. But the family is the nucleus of the neighborhood, and then thus is the nucleus of a city. Now, an observation is from an ethnic perspective, like the African American family has basically been whittled down to where that nucleus there, meaning the father, the mother, and the children, they are no longer together. You know, it's been split.
And all this negative energy comes out.
Right. It's not the majority factor.
Right, the
Split
majority
the atom.
factor. Right. It's been split. And, just like splitting the atom, this energy there has gone who knows where, But we can see the results of it in that the descendants, the children, they are getting into trouble. We also can see it in the population of prisons. We also can see it now in the population of the homeless people there, such that that's one example where the family, like the negative consequences of what has happened to the African American family causes problems, and the problems are crime, such that one cause we can say to crime is the family, and or the lack of that total family, but no solutions have been brought forth as to how to mend that family, put the family back together. In sports, you function as an individual. You're supposed to function as a team, and then oftentimes you have the coach of the team has a difficult time in getting the players to function as a team. But you have this energy, you have lots of wealth or money thrown into a team, and then so far what we have seen of that investment placed in the players on the team, we've seen broken families, we've seen drugs, we've seen crime, and lately suicide, So those are two problems that we need addressed.
Well, obviously, some things like the welfare state, where everybody knows the classic case where if you don't get welfare if the husband and wife are there, so the guy leaves,
right,
and then they get the welfare. So sometimes the government,
right,
maybe not intentionally or maybe intentionally, is
that's
undermining.
Another example there of someone has created this rule to say that if the husband is in the family, there is no monetary means given to the family, so the husband is then forced to leave. And also there's another rule that says that if you have more kids, you will get more money, and which is negative there, because you don't get enough money to take care of one child, So why encourage that person just to have more, and the family did not make that rule. It was the elected just officials or the appointed just officials made that rule.
Or think tanks or other groups that can manipulate.
Or the outside influences manipulating the family.
Right, that's why I say with President Obama, you don't know if it originated with him. In other words, he comes into a system where this is being told him, and this is what you should do. I mean, part of the system, it's just internalized to go this direction.
But we need people just to point out what the shortfalls are in order that we can bring attention to it and to fix it.
But what we're saying is, even when I worked in the jail, I mean, we get some federal prisoners in there, and I'd hear these stories about, I said, well, what is the essence of this federal government? Where's the federal government coming? And they'd tell me, control. They just want to control things. And there's something.
Yeah,
there's something about that.
The default setting of fallen man is to control other people rather than to serve other people.
Right, and you can find,
which is what Christianity believes.
Right, and you get closer to the core of the federal government, you might find this obsession with a control.
There's a classic example of this was in the controversy surrounding the so-called Moynihan report. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was in the Department of Transportation, and for some reason they decided they're going to deal with the problem of black illegitimacy. Okay, black illegitimacy is 21%.
Back then,
as of 1963. Okay, and the white illegitimacy is like a third of that or something like that. So he comes up with a proposal that is what we'll do is we'll have something like twice a day mail delivery. And in order to do this, we're going to hire more mailmen. But it's only black men that we're going to hire, because then they can go back and they will be earning a government wage, they'll be able to support their family. Well, I mean, that sounds pretty non-controversial to me. Okay, it sounds like a good idea. Well, there's this huge uproar. And there was supposed to be, President Johnson liked the idea. They're going to have a national conference. And between him liking the idea, when the national conference held, the whole thing was derailed. Now, who derailed it and why? It was derailed because the plan at this point was to use the contraceptive, which was then illegal in every state of the union, as the solution for black the black welfare problem. Now, nobody's going to say that because it sounds too much like Hitler, you know what I mean? And it sounds like Margaret Sanger and the whole eugenicist movement, so we're not going to say that. We're going to do it under the radar screen, okay? So what happens? That derailed it. The Moynihan Report did not go through. We did not hire the extra mailmen and so on and so forth, but we did start handing out contraceptives to these people, to the people who were in vulnerable situations, who were vulnerable because they were receiving welfare. And what happened is that they poured gasoline on the fire, because the problem was that the families weren't forming, and now you give contraceptives and they're not going to form, because you've destroyed the bond between man and woman. And so as a result, we went to a position where now the white population, I forget the statistics now, but the white population is now 21% illegitimacy, and the black population went up to 70% illegitimacy. So this is another instance of this social engineering, where you're going to manipulate this thing for certain outcomes, and you create a monster instead. So then you got this monster that you created. Well, now how are you going to deal with it? Well, we need to crack down on crime or something like that. And that's precisely the situation that we need to avoid here, because we don't need to reinvent a wheel that doesn't work. I mean, it's bad enough reinventing a regular wheel, but this is like a wheel with 4 sides to it, you know, that never worked to begin with.
Well, obviously they thought 21% illegitimacy was contributing to crime. It was a problem, and they wanted to stop it. And then their solution, in the long run, rises to 70%. And now so in other words, their wisdom is either malicious, or they're stupid, or what do you think?
Also, it gets back to what was said earlier, like an outside influence is trying to put their knowledge or their wisdom onto a neighborhood or a family for their own good, but the good is only seen by the outside influence, meaning that the outside influence does not know what is good for the family. Meaning that the family knows what is good for them. They know what works for them. When you have someone else trying to tell you what's good for you, that doesn't work. You know, you have to find out what is good for you. In every situation that I've read about, when another country tries to use their influence on another country to set their standards of morals or whatever on that country, sooner or later there's some rebellion. Many years ago, every country would try to occupy another country there, you know, just to run it. England at one time dominated the world, and then prior to them, Rome at one time dominated the world, and we should learn from history that you cannot take your values and impose them on someone else.
Well, of course, they don't like Christian missionaries, but the Christian approach is you are imposing your values, but in a couple sense, I mean, all authority in heaven and earth is given to me, Jesus said. So you actually are authorized, you know, and the Christian approach is not this control approach, right? I mean,
but what you had here was basically ethnic pluralism. You had a country that began with a pluralism of states that had different backgrounds, and then that grew into a kind of ethnic pluralism that was manifested in the city with different ethnic neighborhoods. And they were given, because of local autonomy, because of democracy, you were given a certain amount of hegemony among your own ethnic group, your own neighborhood. And those ethnic neighborhoods were then made up of parishes or churches, and the churches then were made up of families, and there was a kind of hierarchy here that led down, as Bob said, down to the nucleus, which is the family itself. And none of these things imposed their order on that nucleus. They recognized that this nucleus had its own authority. It had its own legitimate authority. And the principle of the Catholic Church is the principle of subsidiarity. The higher should not do for the lower what the lower can do for itself. And so the lower, the family has its autonomy. You should not interfere with the autonomy of the family. And those families contribute to communities, and you should not interfere with the autonomy of the community, the neighborhood. And you should not interfere with the autonomy of the city, and so on, up and up and up. Imperialism is the exact opposite of this, where in order to project power, we have to mobilize, the rulers of this empire, have to mobilize large groups of people to project power outward. And that means you have to break them down into individuals and put them in armies and so on and so forth. And that is the antithesis of what this country was supposed to be, namely a republic, as Benjamin Franklin said, if you can keep it.
So the government should preserve, to a degree, the ethnic solidarities, which help preserve the family. But instead, they felt threatened.
They threatened, and so what they did was they used the
like
black,
when Jesus. They felt threatened.
They used the blacks to attack the Poles, and the Poles then attacked the blacks, and they had this internecine warfare that destroyed the social order, so that nobody's children were growing up in a society where they knew what rules to be expected. This is the legacy, I would say, of integration. The legacy of integration is the destruction of black ethnic solidarity and its replacement with this kind of chaos that is, and the cities are a manifestation. All you have to do is look at the cities, and you see how beautiful they were at once and how they were destroyed by these forces.
But you're giving an explanation in part as to why some of the problems in the African American community. Right. I mean, it's not the sole, but he's saying that should be considered a big part.
You can't address this issue until you deal with the stuff that we've raised tonight. And if you try to, then you're just being Rahm Emanuel and saying, never let a crisis go to waste.
You're going to fall short. And
that's not the type of person we need to come in here and make a bad situation worse. You know, we don't need that, especially someone who is coming in with the mindset of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff, and the Israelis in the West Bank. We don't need that. They look at the problems they're creating by the way they're handling the situation. We don't need that here.
It's in the paper almost every other day. Mm-hmm. So, what would you? What's the optimal situation? What should South Bend try to be doing? I mean, what do you see as the answer? The answer is not kind of what what the mayor's doing now, right? It doesn't appear to be.
You have to stop poisoning the minds of young people. You have to restore a social order where certain expectations are accepted. You have to create an environment that supports people, because that's the other side of this whole thing. You know, an environment that supports people, that supports children, and says this is an environment of love, that is an environment of the family where there are certain expectations, and you can't violate these expectations, because we can't live with a family full of rock stars. We can't live with a family full of Led Zeppelins. You know what I mean? This is the antithesis of any social order. So we need to block that out and concentrate on local community. There are lots of local initiatives, I think. You know, I mean, like Fiddler's Hearth is a local initiative, you know, where people get together and play music and talk, and, you know, that type of thing. This is the type of, and it's ethnic. It's ethnic. I think that the restoration of ethnic solidarity is a good thing. You have the Martin Luther King group. That's ethnic solidarity. You know, this is the type of thing that creates social consciousness and sense of responsibility and restores the social fabric. That's what we need to do.
Right. If you had to really use the words of Christ, we should love one another. I mean, ultimately.
Well, yeah, you know, if we followed the doctrines of the Christian church, and the main one is to love one another. If we did that, there would not be a problem. But as Mike said, there's the the other doctrine, or the other city of man. And then that is the desire by men to control other men. And then that desire manifests itself in some of the smallest elements there, such as, one area is the church. Churches do not cooperate together. They just don't, Churches should.
So they're not maximizing their strength.
Right. If churches cooperated together, they could maximize their religious strength, their financial strength, and their influence on the whole city. But due to that other city, or that train of thought,
Or that envy.
Envy there, therefore one person wanting what another person has, people can't come together even at the lowest level there. We have got to instill in our thoughts that we have to love one another.
Right, and of course that takes training. I mean, that's what parenting is, right?
Yeah.
You want your children to learn that, and you could say it, but it's a lifetime that you use your intellect to go in that direction. Mm-hmm. So it takes intellect to put that into practice. Wouldn't you say, Mike? I mean,
yeah, and I think it takes an element of consciousness and resistance. And this is the battle. It's always going to be a battle between the city of God and the city of man. And I think this is our battle right now. I mean, we've had enough of this imperial interference in our lives because of all of these wars that need to be fought for these people's interests. This is our way of resisting that. Saying, look, don't disrupt our local community because of your imperial designs. That's the history of the whole post-World War II period. The history of the destruction of these cities all goes back to that. So it's our time to say, this is what happened. We don't want it to continue. And if this guy, we bring in this Israeli police chief, we're heading in exactly the wrong direction. That's not the direction we want to take. We want some type of Christian local solidarity here.
this is we only have like 30 seconds left, so I think we've touched on some, important things. I mean, you're dealing with things that are scripturally based. And this is a practical situation here, and hopefully, we pray for those that are in authority, that are in position to do things. And I think that, the Scripture does, pray for those in authority, that they can have the wisdom. And we urge people that are watching to do that. And Public Access Michiana will hopefully be on with another show after this, month is over. So, until next time.